Picture this. You're one of the most celebrated writers in human history. You have wealth, fame, a beautiful family, and critical acclaim that most artists only dream of. Yet, you wake up each morning contemplating suicide. You stand at the edge of oblivion, asking yourself one terrifying question. What is the point of any of this? This was Leo Tolstoy at age 50. The man who gave us War and Peace and Anna Karenina found himself paralyzed by an existential crisis so profound that he hid ropes from himself and refused to go hunting because he didn't trust himself with a gun. But what he discovered in his search for meaning would challenge everything we think we know about happiness, purpose, and what it means to live a meaningful life. Today, we're going to explore how a Russian novelist, through the lens of science, religion, and philosophy, may have actually cracked the code to life's greatest mystery. Welcome to Logic Over Spirit, where we dissect the big questions that keep humanity awake at night. I'm your host, and today we're diving deep into one of the most fascinating intellectual journeys ever documented, Leo Tolstoy's quest to answer the meaning of life. Now, before you think this is just another biography of a dead writer, let me be clear. What makes Tolstoy's story absolutely riveting is that he approached this question like a scientist conducts an experiment. He didn't just philosophize from an armchair. He systematically examined every possible answer, tested them against reality, and documented his findings with brutal honesty. Born in 1828 into Russian aristocracy, Tolstoy had everything. He was brilliant, wealthy, and by his 40s, internationally famous. But success didn't satisfy him. Instead, it amplified a growing sense of meaninglessness that threatened to destroy him. His crisis became so severe that he wrote an entire book about it called A Confession, which remains one of the most raw and honest accounts of existential despair ever published. What's remarkable is that Tolstoy didn't just survive his crisis. He emerged with insights that anticipated modern psychology by decades, challenged the foundations of organized religion, and offered a framework for meaning that still resonates today. Scientists studying well-being, philosophers examining ethics, and theologians rethinking faith have all found something profound in Tolstoy's conclusions. So the question isn't just what Tolstoy discovered, it's whether his answer actually works. Can one man's journey out of despair provide a roadmap for the rest of us? Let's find out. Chapter 1: The Crisis. Let's set the stage. It's 1879, and Leo Tolstoy is at the peak of his powers. War and Peace has been published to universal acclaim. He's respected, he's wealthy, and by all external measures, he's winning at life, but internally, he's falling apart. Tolstoy described his state of mind with chilling precision. My life came to a standstill. I could breathe, eat, drink, and sleep. Indeed, I could not help doing so. But there was no life in me because I had no desires whose satisfaction I would have felt to be reasonable. This wasn't depression in the clinical sense, though it certainly had depressive features. This was something more fundamental. Tolstoy had hit what philosophers call the absurd, the collision between our human need for meaning and the apparent meaninglessness of existence. Everything he accomplished felt hollow. Every achievement raised the same question: so what? He began questioning everything systematically. What's the point of raising children if they'll just face the same meaninglessness? What's the purpose of writing masterpieces if everything eventually turns to dust? Why pursue knowledge if it can't answer the one question that matters: why am I here? From a scientific perspective, Tolstoy's crisis reflects what modern psychology calls an existential vacuum. Viktor Frankl, who would later develop logotherapy, described this same phenomenon among concentration camp survivors. When external structures of meaning collapse, humans face what Frankl called Sunday neurosis, a kind of existential despair that emerges when we're forced to confront the question of purpose. But here's where Tolstoy's approach becomes fascinating. Unlike many who face this crisis, he didn't run from it. He didn't numb himself with distractions or rationalize it away. He decided to investigate it with the same rigor he'd applied to researching his novels. He read philosophy, he studied science, he talked to peasants, priests, and intellectuals. He was determined to find an answer or die trying. And for a while, dying seemed like the more likely outcome. Tolstoy examined for possible responses to the meaninglessness he felt. First, ignorance. Some people simply never ask the question. They live unreflectively, moving from one day to the next without confronting the deeper issues. But Tolstoy couldn't know what he discovered. Second, pleasure-seeking. Perhaps the answer was to simply maximize happiness and minimize suffering. But this struck him as hollow, a temporary distraction from the real question. Third, suicide. If life is meaningless, why continue? This option haunted him daily. Fourth, weakness. Continue living despite the meaninglessness, like a coward unable to face the logical conclusion. None of these satisfied him, but then he noticed something curious. While educated, rational people seemed paralyzed by meaninglessness. Many simple, uneducated peasants lived with remarkable purpose and contentment. They faced harder lives, more suffering, and less intellectual sophistication, yet they possessed something he'd lost. What did they know that he didn't? This observation would become the turning point in his search. Chapter 2: The Investigation. Tolstoy turned his attention to the peasants and working people around him. These were individuals who faced grinding poverty, harsh winters, and backbreaking labor. Yet they displayed a sense of purpose that eluded the intellectuals in his social circle. The difference, he concluded, was faith. Now, before you think this is heading toward a simple religious conversion story, stay with me. Because Tolstoy's relationship with faith was anything but conventional. He began studying religion seriously, not as a passive believer, but as an investigator. He examined Christianity, but also Buddhism, Islam, and various philosophical traditions. He read the Gospels in their original Greek. He attended church services and spoke with theologians. And what he discovered both attracted and repelled him. On one hand, religious faith provided what he'd been desperately seeking, a framework for meaning that transcended individual mortality. Religious people had an answer to why they existed, even if that answer couldn't be scientifically proven. They believed their lives served a divine purpose, and this belief gave them strength to endure suffering and motivation to act morally. Quote from Tolstoy, "Faith is the force of life. If a man lives, he believes in something. If he did not believe that one must live for something, he would not live." From a philosophical perspective, this aligns with what thinkers like Kierkegaard called the leap of faith. Some truths, they argued, cannot be reached through reason alone. They require a commitment that goes beyond empirical evidence. The religious peasants possessed something the rational intellectuals lacked, a willingness to believe in something larger than themselves. But here's where Tolstoy ran into a massive problem. While he found profound truth in the ethical teachings of Jesus, particularly the Sermon on the Mount, he couldn't accept the supernatural elements of organized Christianity. Miracles, resurrections, the virgin birth, these struck him as irrational additions that obscured the real message. The institutional church, with its wealth, political power, and dogma, seemed to contradict everything Jesus actually taught. This put Tolstoy in a fascinating position. He needed faith to escape meaninglessness, but he couldn't embrace faith as it was presented to him. So he did something radical. He decided to separate the kernel from the husk, to extract what he saw as the genuine spiritual truth from the cultural and supernatural packaging. He wrote "The Kingdom of God is within you," arguing that Jesus' core message was about how to live ethically in this world, not about achieving salvation in the next. He focused on the commandments of nonviolence, love for enemies, and rejection of material wealth. These weren't promises about heaven, they were instructions for creating meaning through how we treat each other. From a scientific standpoint, modern research actually supports some of Tolstoy's conclusions. Studies on well-being consistently show that people with strong spiritual or religious beliefs report higher life satisfaction, better mental health outcomes, and greater resilience in the face of adversity. But interestingly, these benefits don't require belief in supernatural claims. What matters is having a coherent worldview that provides purpose and connects the individual to something beyond themselves. This is where Tolstoy's synthesis becomes powerful. He recognized that rational thought alone couldn't provide meaning because meaning isn't a logical proposition. It's not something you prove, it's something you commit to. But that commitment doesn't have to be irrational. It can be grounded in values and practices that enhance life, reduce suffering, and create connection. He found his answer not in theology, but in action. The meaning of life wasn't something to be understood intellectually. It was something to be lived practically. Chapter 3: The Solution. So what was Tolstoy's final answer? After years of crisis, study, and soul-searching, what conclusion did he reach about the meaning of life? Here it is, and it might surprise you. The meaning of life, according to Tolstoy, is to live in accordance with the divine will, which manifests as love and service to others. But strip away the religious language, and what you get is something profound. Meaning comes from transcending self-interest and connecting to something larger than yourself. Let me break this down from our three angles: philosophy, religion, and science. Philosophically, Tolstoy arrived at a position similar to existentialism before existentialism was formally defined. He concluded that life has no inherent, objective meaning handed down from the universe. The cosmos doesn't care about you. Rocks and stars have no purpose, but humans are unique. We have the capacity to create meaning through our choices and actions. We're meaning-making creatures, however, and this is crucial. Tolstoy rejected pure subjectivism. You can't just decide that eating ice cream or playing video games is the meaning of life and expect that to satisfy your existential hunger. Why? Because those pursuits are ultimately self-referential. They don't connect you to anything beyond your momentary pleasure. Real meaning, Tolstoy argued, requires self-transcendence. He wrote, "The meaning of my life is to live in such a way that my life serves the life of all." This is not a mystical claim. It's a practical framework. When you orient your life toward reducing suffering, increasing flourishing, and serving others, you plug into something that outlasts your individual existence. Your actions ripple outward. You become part of a story larger than yourself. Religiously, Tolstoy found validation for this in what he called rational Christianity. He believed Jesus was not primarily teaching about an afterlife but about the kingdom of God on earth, a way of organizing human society based on love, nonviolence, and mutual service. He saw this message echoed in Buddhism's emphasis on compassion, in Stoicism's focus on virtue, and in various wisdom traditions across cultures. The religious impulse, at its best, points us toward self-transcendence. It asks us to die to the ego and live for something higher. Prayer, meditation, and spiritual practice are technologies for transforming consciousness from self-centered to other-centered. Tolstoy embraced this transformative aspect while rejecting supernatural claims he couldn't verify. Scientifically, modern psychology has extensively validated Tolstoy's core insight. Research on eudaimonic well-being, a term derived from Aristotle meaning human flourishing, shows that people who live purpose-driven lives centered on contributing to others report deeper life satisfaction than those pursuing hedonic happiness alone. Studies on altruism and prosocial behavior demonstrate that acts of service trigger the release of neurotransmitters associated with reward and bonding. When we help others, our brains literally light up with pleasure. But it's not the shallow pleasure of consumption. It's what researchers call the helper's high, a profound sense of meaning and connection. Furthermore, terror management theory in psychology explains why humans need symbolic immortality. We're the only species aware of our mortality, and this awareness creates existential anxiety. We cope by investing in cultural worldviews and legacy that outlive us. Tolstoy's solution, serving life itself, is essentially a secular form of symbolic immortality. Your body dies, but the love you gave and the lives you touched continue. Tolstoy implemented his philosophy radically. He gave away his wealth, dressed as a peasant, worked in the fields, and devoted himself to social reform. He started schools for peasant children, wrote against the death penalty and war, and became a major influence on figures like Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr., who adapted his principle of nonviolent resistance to achieve massive social change. His answer to the meaning of life wasn't a theory, it was a practice: love people, reduce suffering, resist violence, live simply, serve something beyond yourself. Do this, and meaning emerges not as a concept to grasp, but as a reality to inhabit. Quote from Tolstoy, "The sole meaning of life is to serve humanity by contributing to the establishment of the kingdom of God, which can only be done by the recognition and profession of the truth by every man." Now, you might be wondering, does this actually work? Can Tolstoy's answer satisfy the existential hunger that drove him to the brink of suicide? Let's examine that. Chapter for the proof. Here's the ultimate test of any philosophy. Does it improve lives? Does it actually deliver on its promises? With Tolstoy, we have a fascinating case study because he lived his answer for the final 30 years of his life. We can examine the results. By all accounts, Tolstoy found what he was looking for. After his conversion, he no longer contemplated suicide. He lived with purpose and vigor until his death at age 82. He wrote prolifically, not just novels but essays on morality, religion, and social reform that influenced millions. His letters and diaries from this period reflect a man at peace with existence, even as he remained critical of society's injustices. But more telling than Tolstoy's personal transformation is the legacy of his ideas. Gandhi credited Tolstoy's writings, particularly The Kingdom of God is Within You, as pivotal in developing his philosophy of nonviolent resistance. This philosophy, in turn, inspired Martin Luther King Jr. and the American Civil Rights Movement, Nelson Mandela's struggle against apartheid, and countless other social movements that prioritized moral force over physical violence. These weren't just ideas circulating in academic journals. They changed history. They gave people facing oppression a framework for action that created meaning through suffering and transformed that suffering into liberation. That's a pretty powerful validation. From a scientific perspective, let's look at what research tells us about Tolstoy's prescription for meaning. First, the emphasis on service and contribution aligns with what positive psychologists call generativity, the concern for establishing and guiding the next generation. Studies show that generativity is strongly correlated with life satisfaction, particularly in midlife and beyond. Second, Tolstoy's focus on simplicity and rejection of materialism is validated by research showing that once basic needs are met, additional wealth provides diminishing returns on happiness. Meanwhile, experiences of connection, growth, and contribution consistently predict well-being across cultures. Third, his emphasis on living according to values rather than impulses aligns with research on self-determination theory, which identifies autonomy, competence, and relatedness as fundamental psychological needs. When we act from deeply held values rather than external pressures or momentary desires, we experience greater integrity and life satisfaction. Fourth, his practice of self-transcendence, moving beyond ego-centered concerns, corresponds to what psychologists call flow states and what neuroscientists observe in meditation practitioners, a quieting of the default mode network, the brain region associated with self-referential thinking. When we stop obsessing about ourselves, we paradoxically feel more alive. But let's also address the critiques. Some argue that Tolstoy's philosophy is too demanding. Not everyone can give away their wealth and live as a peasant. Some suggest it's naive, that a world organized purely on love and nonviolence is unrealistic given human nature. Others point out that Tolstoy himself was often difficult, dogmatic, and caused suffering to his own family through his rigid adherence to his principles. These critiques have merit. Tolstoy wasn't perfect, and his specific implementation isn't a blueprint everyone should follow. But here's what I think is important. Tolstoy didn't claim to have found the only path to meaning. He found his path. What makes his journey valuable isn't that we should all become Russian peasant philosophers, but that he demonstrated a method for discovering meaning that anyone can adapt. The method is this. First, confront the question honestly. Don't hide from existential uncertainty behind distractions. Second, examine all possible answers systematically. Look at what philosophy, religion, and science offer. Third, test proposed answers against lived experience. Does this actually make life better? Fourth, commit to a framework that connects you to something beyond yourself. And fifth, live that commitment through action, not just belief. The specific content of your answer might differ from Tolstoy's. You might find meaning through art, through parenting, through scientific discovery, through spiritual practice, or through fighting for justice. What matters is that your answer involves self-transcendence and service to life in some form. Because that's what research, wisdom traditions, and Tolstoy's experience all point toward. We find ourselves by losing ourselves in something greater. Tolstoy wrote near the end of his life, "True life is lived when tiny changes occur." This is profound. Meaning isn't found in grand gestures or sudden revelations. It's built through daily choices to live for others, to reduce suffering where we can, to create rather than destroy, to connect rather than isolate. Conclusion. So, did Leo Tolstoy solve the meaning of life? Let's be honest. There's no final, provable answer to life's ultimate question. The universe isn't going to hand you a certificate that says, "Congratulations, you figured it out," but what Tolstoy did accomplish is remarkable. He mapped the territory of existential crisis with unflinching honesty. He synthesized insights from philosophy, religion, and rational inquiry. And he offered a practical framework that has demonstrably improved countless lives. His answer, love and serve life itself, works not because it's objectively true in some metaphysical sense, but because it aligns with how humans actually function. We're social creatures who need connection. We're narrative beings who need purpose. We're conscious animals who must cope with mortality. Tolstoy's prescription addresses all of these needs. What I find most powerful about Tolstoy's journey is that he didn't find meaning despite his crisis. He found it through his crisis. The despair forced him to question everything, and that questioning led to insights he never would have reached from a place of comfortable ignorance. Sometimes we have to lose the meaning we thought we had in order to discover the meaning we actually need. If you're watching this video, you're probably asking some of the same questions Tolstoy asked. What's the point? Why does any of this matter? And maybe you're feeling some of that same existential dread that paralyzed him at 50. If so, here's what I want you to take away. The fact that you're asking the question means you're alive in the deepest sense. You're not sleepwalking through existence. You're awake, and that's both terrifying and beautiful. The meaning you're searching for isn't hiding in a philosophy book or a religious text or a scientific theory, though all of those might offer clues. It's waiting to be created through how you choose to live. Through the love you give, through the suffering you alleviate, through the connections you build, through the values you embody. Tolstoy's life proves that it's possible to emerge from the abyss of meaninglessness into a life of profound purpose, but it requires courage, the courage to face the hard questions, the courage to let go of comforting illusions, and most of all, the courage to commit to something larger than yourself, even when you can't prove it's the right choice. As Tolstoy himself put it, everyone thinks of changing the world, but no one thinks of changing himself. Maybe the meaning of life starts there, with the tiny changes we make in ourselves that ripple outward into the world. If this video resonated with you, share it with someone who might be struggling with these questions. Subscribe to Logic Over Spirit for more deep dives into philosophy, science, and the big ideas that shape our lives. And in the comments, tell me, what gives your life meaning? What gets you out of bed in the morning? Let's continue this conversation together. Because if Tolstoy taught us anything, it's that we're not meant to figure this out alone. We're in this together, and that might be the most meaningful truth of all. Until next time, keep questioning, keep growing, and keep living. Thank you for watching.